Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Merle Massey, and I'm the coordinator of the Undergraduate Research Initiative at the University of Saskatchewan. One of the programs I run is SURE, so Student Undergraduate Research Experience. And with us today, we have Jill McMillan, who is the Graduate Writing Specialist at the University of Saskatchewan Library. And I love the session that Jill's going to be giving us today. This is around plain language. And speaking as an author myself, learning how to write in a way that your audience understands what you wrote the first time they read it is a skill unto itself. And so, with that, Jill, I will pass this directly over to you.
All right, so I'm also very excited to talk about this topic, and it's a topic that I'm increasingly invested in. I find as I get a bit older and more experienced, because I think when it comes down to it, writing is always about ensuring that our reader understands us. And sometimes we get a little bit convoluted in how we are expressing ourselves. That's almost a stereotype when we're looking at academic writing. So taking some cues from this plain language movement can really help inform how we are presenting our work in a way that people are going to be able to understand it more easily on the first pass. So our agenda is as follows. First, we're going to quickly define plain language. We're going to look at why we should care about plain language, the value of it. And then we're really going to focus on some practical strategies for making language clearer. And we will also touch on the concept of plain language summaries, and then identify a couple of training resources if you want to learn more about this topic. So again, plain language is really all about helping readers to understand your intended message. When we are speaking about plain language, it's really a style of writing that is clear and helps reduce barriers to understanding, because we are writing for an audience. That audience needs to understand what we are trying to communicate to them. And so the intent is really just to ensure that really important, really critical information is made more accessible. It's not about dumbing language down. We don't actually oversimplify the content. Rather, we try and figure out ways to ensure that the content is accurately but clearly presented to our readers. And this is quite important when you consider literacy levels in a Canadian or a global context. So Canada has a reputation for being a highly literate society, but as we can see from this survey, again, it's about a 10-year-old survey, almost a 10-year-old survey. We see that actually about half of Canadian adults are either poor or narrow readers, meaning that more complicated text would actually cause them quite a bit of difficulty as they are reading. And so, depending on who we want to share our content with, we really need to be mindful of how we are presenting our information accordingly. So when we write plainly, we actually achieve several different outcomes. First, we increase the chance that people will access and understand the text. So hopefully they will find it in the first place. And then it's going to also serve to make it more accessible to people with disabilities. So you might be familiar with this concept of universal design, where if things are made with um, the widest number of people in mind, it actually makes it easier for everyone else to access. That's sort of what plain language does as well. It's sort of like universal design for communication. It also takes into account how people consume information. And so if you have a very important message that you need to um, have as your takeaway, you would actually present that earlier on. And when we consider how people are now accessing information, a lot of people use their phones. You might actually be using your phone to access today's session, for instance. If that's the case, often we have a much smaller screen that that we are viewing to access that text. And so rather than have someone scroll and scroll and scroll until they find the most important message, we would have that near the top of our text. And then in terms of some of pragmatics, and this is why government and organizations can be quite invested in plain language. It can help institutions and individuals save resources when editing and translating text, because if the text is presented in a clearer way to begin with, it's going to be less complicated for someone else editing or translating that text, especially in a bilingual country like Canada. And then it also can help to save money. So if you're a business and people are have some frequently asked questions, for instance, if these can be presented clearly on your website, it's going to reduce the likelihood that they're going to phone up customer service. Likewise, if you are at a government office, if you have government documents presented in a more plain and accessible way, fewer people are going to phone with questions about how to fill out those forms. So there are a lot of really interesting outcomes that are attached to the idea of plain language. For academics, there's also a lot of value here. Number one, we can use a lot of the similar strategies from this sort of plain language philosophy to help improve the readability of our own writing. And especially if you are writing for a multidisciplinary or multilingual audience, the more clearly you can present your ideas, it's more people are going to want to read your work. We also increasingly see studies that are looking at which papers get cited by other academics. And what's interesting is that we see those papers that are written in a more readable way actually get cited more because people understand those papers more easily. And so this can actually attach to some career progression or some career success because more people are engaging with the research that you're producing. It's also a valuable way to develop transferable skills. So a lot of academics, for instance, work with government partners. They receive funding and then they sort of work in tandem with a government or community partner. And if the deliverables that you have to produce in line with their standards are following plain language principles, then you would be able to um, show your rhetorical awareness and actually write text that's appropriate to that audience. And lastly, it's also very valuable if you want to communicate your research to promote public engagement. And this is where the text known as a plain language summary comes into play. And that's something that we're going to look at a little bit later in today's session. Now, what are some common barriers to understanding? We have a couple that have been identified here, and they are going to sort of create the foundation for the strategies that we're going to look at in a few minutes for putting our language into a plainer language. So key barriers to understanding include unfamiliar words, phrases, jargon, or specialized terminology. In some ways, the bread and butter of academic writing, which is often so specialized. And so we have to grapple with that a little bit if we are writing for a more diverse audience. Dense or abstract language, again, very common in academic writing and something that can make it very difficult for readers to understand what you are trying to communicate. Another barrier, words that can be misinterpreted or that have multiple meanings. So words like crane, right, novel, lie, minute, or is that minute, discount. And this speaks to the origins of the English language, where we just have these words that might not exist in other languages in such great numbers, where you have all these possible interpretations of the same word. And lastly, another barrier it might be distracting visual elements. And this is more key when you're writing online, but certainly even in a research paper, for instance, it can be very distracting if things aren't formatted appropriately, if visuals that are embedded don't really speak to the surrounding prose. All of those just visual impressions can either enhance or impede understanding. So what do we do? How do we actually overcome these barriers? Well, we have very concrete strategies that we can follow, really practical strategies. The first is we can use descriptive, specific, and familiar words instead of those unfamiliar words that might be a barrier. We can also reduce jargon, specialized terminology, and acronyms. We can reduce or eliminate words that have multiple meanings. We can use personal pronouns when appropriate. We can make use of the active voice over the passive voice. We can also make use of parallel constructions. And lastly, we can review visual elements to create a better reading experience overall. So our first strategy is all about simplifying vocabulary. Now here we have an assortment of words, and I would ask if you'd like to participate in the chat, how would you change some of these words? And you can change all of them. You can just take a selection, but let's take about 2 minutes. How could you use a different word than advantageous, than adversely impact on, than attempt or benefit or currently or exhibit? Let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. Great suggestions coming in. And some of the suggestions differ from each other. And then again, this sort of speaks to the fun of these sort of exercises, because we recognize actually we often have a lot of different options available to us as writers. And I think this is why I love writing so much, is because you're always in this moment of creation. So let's see some words that we might use to replace the words on this list. So advantageous, we might just change that to something like helpful, or adversely impact on, hurt, or set back. Attempt can be try. That was one of the recommendations that popped up in the chat. Benefit can become help. Currently, net can become now. That came up a few times in the chat. Exhibit can become show. That also came up a few times. And this is a decision that you always have to make when you are writing. What do you want to achieve with your work? Do you want to ensure that folks will understand? Are you trying to achieve a certain tone? And can you actually merge those two intents when you are producing your text? Always something to think about as you are producing your text. All right, let's move into our next strategy. This is all about reducing jargon. Again, academic jargon is something that we have probably all encountered, and we probably all use often without really realizing it, because we start to internalize it. And that's fine, because jargon has value in certain contexts. It's not that it's inherently good or bad, but it can make things unnecessarily wordy or complicated. So here we have a few sort of partial phrases that I would like us to try and rephrase to be a little bit more plain and clear. So our first example is thus within given parameters. Our second example, must utilize and be functionally interwoven with. And our third is present a valuable challenge showing the necessity for. How might you sort of translate any of these phrases? Again, we'll take 1 or 2 minutes, contribute in the chat, and then we'll have a check-in before moving on to our next strategy. Any surrounding context. And so we see how when things are presented in a sort of jargon heavy or really abstract way, it's actually quite difficult to parse meaning from it. And that's sort of the purpose of an exercise like this, is to figure out, is there a way to first A, understand what is being said here, and B, present it in a slightly more comprehensible way. And so we had some great suggestions coming in. We'll also take a look at some suggestions here. So we have 2 options for each. And again, it sort of shows how we always have these choices available to us. For our first example, thus within given parameters, this could translate into something like when working with these restrictions or within certain limits. So recognizing that you have to take these sort of limitations into consideration when coming up with a certain solution or undertaking a certain task. Our second example, must utilize and be functionally interwoven with. This could translate into something like must use components of, must incorporate elements of. But we had some other suggestions coming in that were even more straightforward. So must use and apply, or must use and work with. And so I think there is still scope here to clarify and make more clear the intent of the sentence. And our last example presents a valuable challenge showing the necessity for. This could turn into something like provides us an opportunity to show the need for, or this blank shows why blank is important. But I also like the suggestion that came up around the concept of opportunity. Like this is an opportunity to do X, Y, or Z. So even here, we might refine and clarify what we are writing and make it a little bit more clear. But I think, generally speaking, anytime that you're encountering jargon that seems to exist solely for the purpose of jargon, rather than communicating something very specialized, you want to reduce it and eliminate it as much as possible. So again, I've already referenced this a little bit. Jargon and specialized terminology is not inherently bad. There are very few things in writing that are actually good or bad. It's just all about those choices to ensure that people understand what we're writing about. And I share this quote. Jargon provides a shorthand for concepts that would otherwise take many sentences to describe. It signals the author's awareness of and presence within in-group conversations. So it can be this sort of insider vocabulary that's used, and it has a lot of value in terms of just making communication more brief. The issue that arises is that if a reader does not have this sort of shared understanding, it's going to become a barrier. So if you had two musicians, for instance, and they were talking about their compositions, they would have all of this insider specialized vocabulary that they would both immediately understand. But if someone who didn't have a music background was listening in on that conversation, they would probably be very lost and not be able to understand what the two people were speaking about. So when we're making use of audience and specialized terminology, we really want to be mindful of who we're sharing this information with, who is our audience. So if we are writing for someone outside of that group, we want to remove that excess jargon. And it might be that you are in a very particular subfield within a larger discipline. And so even people in that larger discipline might have a difficult time understanding what you were saying if you are too focused on that subgroup within that discipline. So always just try and think, who is meant to read this work, and how can I make it clear for them? Acronyms sort of relate to this concept of jargon and specialized terminology. Acronyms are commonly used in all sorts of different contexts. And they can be very, very useful as well because they're a bit of a shorthand, a placeholder for these larger words. But you want to be mindful of different forms of acronyms that exist. So we have common ones, specialist ones, and invented ones. And so if you're writing for a more general or diverse audience, you really want to be mindful of how you are using this strategy, how you are using your acronyms. If it's a very commonly used acronym, you can just use it. So DNA, CT scan, those are used more commonly than than their long form text, their long form titles or descriptors. So if that's what people understand it as, use that acronym. Where you need to start making judgments is when you have specialist acronyms. So if you're writing for someone outside your immediate, more specialized group, then you'll need to incorporate some definition around that acronym. So, for instance, if you are not a soccer fan, this acronym WHUFC would probably make no sense to you. So having that descriptor in parentheses, West Ham United Football Club, suddenly you have a greater understanding that, okay, this is in reference to some sort of sports team. Now, invented acronyms, we just want to avoid those at all costs. So I'm not going to make use of PL to refer to plain language, for instance, if I was writing something for a general audience. And I think sometimes we're tempted to sort of create those acronyms because we get tired of writing out the same thing time and time again. But generally, you want to avoid them, especially if you're writing for a broader audience. All right, our third strategy is all about reducing ambiguity. So here we have 3 words, very common words in the English language: domestic, run, lead. Now, what do these words actually mean? What are the synonyms? How would you define these words? Let's take 1 or 2 minutes and contribute in the chat. What meaning would you attach to any one of these words? Chat are happening in the chat box right now because these are very seemingly simple and commonplace words. But when we actually look at these individually and try and explain what they mean, suddenly we realize, oh, we have multiple meanings attached to all of these words. So we domestic, it could refer to a house or a home, something that's local. So there's reference to Canada, for instance, if you're talking about trade, domestic trade. But if you're talking about animals, it could refer to something being tame, for instance. So we have all of these sort of competing meanings that are going to be very dependent on context. Run becomes a little bit more complex because we have, okay, well, the exercise, like to run versus walk, but it could be about testing or completing a process or this sort of unbroken series of events. And in this way, it's a noun. But then we also have where it could refer to broken stitches in a cloth. So if you have a run in your tights, for instance, or it could refer to sort of this short trip, like I took a run down to the store. You didn't actually run to the store, it was just signaling the very short nature of the trip. And then led or lead, so even the pronunciation is going to be different depending on the meaning of it. So it could refer to that metallic material, or it could be evidence pointing to a possible solution, so leading to some sort of conclusion. A lead actor or actress, or a lead that's used to guide an animal. So you sort of attach to a harness, or could something that could result in. It just becomes more and more complex the more that we look at all of these words. And often we use them in a fairly unconscious way, especially if you are a native English speaker. But certainly the English language has all of these commonplace words that are actually very complex. And this just speaks to the history of the English language, where it took in influences from different languages, and it has had a very strange evolution. It's a very plastic language. It allows for the integration of borrowed words and really interesting stuff. But ultimately is yes, a magpie language. I always refer to it as a mongrel language, where it's just sort of made up of all these different influences. And fortunately, things are often situated in appropriate context. And so we're able to infer the meaning. But what can happen is that sometimes the context isn't actually clarifying the meaning in the way that we intended. And so there can be some misinterpretation. So if you find yourself in a situation where you realize, oh, in this situation, even with some of this contextual information, there might be some ambiguity here. There might be some possibility for misinterpretation. You'd want to try and change the word to find a more precise word. And so this is just one strategy to keep in mind. If you have words that have multiple meanings, if the context isn't making the intended meaning clear, then change the word. All right, a fourth strategy, and this is a little bit controversial, but it's to use personal pronouns. This is very much a philosophy within under the umbrella, or shall we say, of plain language as this movement. In academic context, it's a little bit more of a conversation. There's a lot more emphasis on personal pronouns in academic writing, but this often depends on the discipline or even the guidance or input that you receive from supervisors and professors as to what they prefer. That being said, personal pronouns can be very, very powerful. So using words like I, you, we, or us, they can help to establish this more conversational tone. And in doing so, help make information a little bit easier to understand. And this makes a lot of sense because this is how the majority of humans are introduced to language. It's through conversation, it's through dialogue, it's through real time interactions with other people. So we're attuned to this form of communication. And we can replicate that in written prose, in part by using something like personal pronouns. But that being said, you always want to be mindful of that context in which you are writing to determine if the personal pronoun is going to be appropriate and if it can or should be used. So sometimes depending on tone, you might decide whether or not to use it. That being said, let's actually look at some examples of a piece of text that doesn't feature personal pronouns and one that does, and see which one you prefer and why. So our first sample, investigators who have additional questions about this funding opportunity should contact the program. Sample 2, contact us if you have additional questions about this funding opportunity. Which do you prefer and why? Let's just take a minute or so in the chat. We have some preference emerging for the second. And certainly if investigators are the ones reading this text in the first place, then that second example is going to probably resonate with them a lot more, because they know they're the ones who are investigating this funding opportunity in the first place. And now they know, okay, I need to contact them if I have to contact the program if I have any additional questions. And as if you were noting, it's just really straight to the point. We're sort of cutting out any pretense of this sort of ambiguous or mythical investigator or theoretical investigator. We know that the investigator is the reader. So it makes more sense to use the personal pronoun. All right, our fifth strategy, rather, is making use of the active voice. This is simply a means of organizing information within sentences in a way that the subject of the sentence is made more prominent. And so here we have examples of the active and the passive in action. So in an active sentence, the subject is explicitly doing the action. For example, the researcher tests the soil sample. So the researcher is the subject of the sentence, and the action is very clear. They're testing the soil. In a passive sentence, we're taking the exact same information, but we're just presenting it in a slightly different way. So the subject is the receiver of the action. So for example, the soil sample is tested by the researcher. Exact same information is being communicated, just in a slightly different way, because the soil sample, they sort of become the subject of the sentence instead, and they're receiving that action of being tested upon. So both of them make perfect sense. It's just that we might prefer one to the other when we're reading. So usually we prefer the active, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. The passive has a few characteristics that make it easy to identify. So we often have the presence of a to be verb before the main verb. So we have to insert a word such as is or was before the main verb in the sentence. And the main verb is often going to end with either ed or en. And there's also often the inclusion of by in order to make it clear who is actually doing the action to the subject that is receiving that action. So we can work out the meaning. It's just more of a style consideration. So looking at it from a slightly different approach. So the active, the cat was chasing the mouse. The passive, the mouse was being chased by the cat. So we're just sort of repositioning who the subject of the sentence is. The benefits of the active voice is that usually it can make relationships a bit more easily understood. And that's because the who or what um, of who is doing the action must be explicitly identified, whereas it might only be implied in the passive. So that's one of the first benefits. The main benefit, perhaps, though, is that sentences are more direct and consequently tend to be less wordy, though there are some exceptions to this. So if we see the example here, the researcher tested the soil sample, 6 words. Passive, the soil sample was tested by the researcher, 8 words. So we're taking the exact same information, but it's taking us longer to share it because we have to use 2 more words. That being said, if we just want to imply the subject, so if we want to remove reference to that researcher altogether, we could just say the soil sample was tested and leave it to our audience to sort of fill in the rest of the information. So again, our choice around the active and the passive are going to be driven by context in terms of what we want to emphasize in a sentence. But if you are worried that you have a lot of passive sentences, there are some simple tricks to make them more active. And it's all about just reorganizing, repositioning information within the sentence. And one of the easiest ways to do this is to take the subject or the doer and place that at the beginning of the sentence. And if it's not obvious, so if it's a passive sentence where that subject or that doer is implied, then you actually have to insert some new information when you are revising. So here we have an example of a passive sentence. Significant improvements in policy are required to address housing insecurity in Northern Canada. Now, we're missing information in this sentence. What would you suggest is missing from this sentence? Let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. Need to put these policies in place, like who's responsible? Is it a certain level of government, for instance? And as a result, we have ambiguity, we have some confusion because we actually haven't made the doer of the subject explicit. So once we know, oh, okay, there's actually some missing information, even though grammatically the sentence is fine, we know that when we're revising it, we're making that passive sentence more active, we need to include information that's going to make it more obvious to our reader. So we've identified, okay, if we're referencing policies, this is in all likelihood something about government. And ultimately, you would be the one shaping your sentence. So you would have this information perhaps more readily at hand than you might when you're just seeing this sentence in isolation. So if we identify, okay, well, I'm actually talking about the government needing to do something because government is usually responsible for policy, then I would take information about the government and I'd incorporate that into the redrafted sentence. So we might write it as government must improve policies that address housing insecurity in Northern Canada. And in this rewriting, it's actually a little bit more to the point than that passive sentence that we were revising, right? It's 2 words shorter, which might not seem like a lot, but if you had every sentence in a research paper that could actually be shortened by 2 or 3 words, that would add up significantly um, in the text overall. Now, if you want to be a little bit more specific or a little bit more plain in your approach, you might use the second example here. Government needs to introduce policies that improve people's access to housing in Northern Canada in order to humanize the information that you're trying to convey. So making it a little bit less of a something a little less abstract, shall we say. Because when we're talking about housing insecurity, what we're really talking about is the fact that people don't have easy enough access to housing. So if we put that person in there, that or reference to people, it can make us more attuned to what the real issue is. And this would actually lengthen it a little bit. So it's going to depend on the tone you want to strike and the information that you want to convey when you're communicating to your reader. All right. Again, as with so many things, there's often not a right or a wrong when it comes to writing. You just want to make sure that you're using structures intentionally and choosing the ones that make the most sense for the context. But when we're talking about plain language writing, the default is to make use of active sentence structures. Another strategy is to make use of parallel constructions. And this is simply referencing how if you have elements in a sentence that are equal to each other, we can give them equal grammatical weight to signal this sort of equality. So if we have a sentence like the child was described as bookish, introspective, and thoughtful, here we have a series of adjectives. So it creates a sense of fluency and improves readability. Whereas if we have unparalleled structures, they can become quite distracting for readers. So here we have an example of an unparalleled sentence fragment or phrase. Volunteers enhance the quality of care for patients and complementing the role of the staff. How might you reword this phrase to make the elements parallel? Let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. So the suggestion in the chat is to change how the verb complement has been conjugated. So that would be an easy fix because the unparalleled structure that's happening in that first example is stemming from the fact that we have verbs that are not aligning with each other. Enhance is presented in simple present tense, complementing is presented in present perfect. We can change that and just make those verbs conjugated the same way in our parallel example. So enhance and complement. So this is a way where things then flow a little bit more. We don't get stuck when we are reading. There are lots of different ways in which we can make use of parallel constructions, and they are as follows. We can make use of strings of adjectives. So the kitten is playful and silly and on and on and on, however you want to describe this kitten. We can make use of strings of nouns. So she likes apples, grapes, and strawberries. We can make use of strings of to verbs. So they plan to swim, to hike, and to fish during their vacation. Or we can, and this is perhaps a bit more common, if we have a string of verbs, we can make use of to verb, 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 verb. The government is going to ease restrictions, encourage personal responsibility, and monitor outbreaks in the coming weeks. So especially if we have lists, those parallel structures become more important, because otherwise it will sort of create a distorted rhythm as a reader is engaging with the text. All right, our next strategy is all about visuals, and then we're going to quickly look at plain language summaries and then wrap up today's session. We want to consider where the reading will happen. So how are people actually engaging with the text? Are they looking at a printed document, or are they looking at online? And then if they're looking at it online, are they going to consume this on their computer or on their phone? So lots of different questions to ask ourselves. So thinking about how something is going to present visually is going to help us to create something that's going to be easier to read. If we have a lot of long paragraphs and sentences, we can break those up. We can make use of bullets to help organize things that are part of lists. This is especially important if you're producing text for online. And we can also make use of more accessible fonts. So sans serif fonts are more easy to read. So things like Arial, for instance, are just easier for folks to visually decode. So if we look at these two samples, for instance, sample one, when we write plainly, we reduce unfamiliar words with familiar words, reduce or eliminate jargon, and rewrite passive sentences to be more active. There's nothing wrong with that sample, but we have the option to actually take that list and break it down into a bullet list. So to write plainly, replace unfamiliar words with familiar words, reduce or eliminate jargon, rewrite passive sentences to be more active. A benefit is that in addition to it being a little bit less dense visually, it actually results in fewer words overall. So this is where a bulleted list can help us to enhance our message. All right, so we have about 7 minutes left to look at plain language summaries. And this is really relates to how we can communicate research a little bit beyond academia. Simply put, they are a communication tool that allow researchers to share complex research with a wider audience. They might be known as lay summaries or plain language abstracts. And you might actually be asked to produce one of these in your courses or at some point in the future in your studies. And the intent of this is really to help break down some of those barriers between specialist and non-specialist audiences. So if your research, for instance, has a community focus and you want to ensure that community partners or stakeholders can understand the complexity of your research, you can present it in a document that would accompany a standard academic summary or abstract rather. And increasingly, they are popular as a project or funding requirement, or you might encounter them when you are researching articles. You might see that in a journal, they will have the academic abstract as well as a plain language summary that you can look at before looking at the larger document. So we see some interesting movements in academia that are encouraging academics to make their work a little bit more accessible. So here we have sort of that conventional academic type of writing. It reads as follows. For this analysis, we selected 353 Baltimore longitudinal study of aging BLSA participants who had data on fungiform papillae density, marker of taste bud number, and markers of how our body handles glucose, such as fasting blood glucose levels. BLSA is an ongoing prospective observational study of normative aging in community dwelling volunteers, established since 1958, and is sponsored by the National Institute on Aging. We found that lower fungiform papillae density is strongly correlated both with advancing age and with higher fasting blood glucose levels. These results support the hypothesis that taste bud density plays a role in glucose metabolism during the aging process. Okay, now how much of that did you understand? Well, it would depend on what your background is. If you are someone who is studying biology, human physiology, nutrition. You might say, what's wrong with this? I understood it perfectly. The rest of us might be scratching our heads a little bit or becoming quite bored. So what strategies might you make use of to make this text a little bit easier to read? Let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. Off a little bit, and it was in sort of acknowledgement, because in an academic context, this does seem really normal. This seems like really sort of plain writing. But sometimes I think we have to remind ourselves that we operate within such a very specific world context, and that for many people outside of academia, this would just prove incredibly confusing. For myself, when I was originally reading this, I was thinking, okay, this is something about um, um, like how our body reacts to like sugar, and whether that's through tasting or processing, and it involves this interesting study. But I didn't have a lot of engagement with it. Um, so we might revise it as follows. This is not my revision, I'm borrowing it. But we might present the information in a little bit more approachable way. So it could read as follows. In this study, we analyzed data from 353 participants in the National Institute on Aging's Baltimore longitudinal study of aging BLSA. Specifically, we looked at number of taste buds, fungiform papilla density, and markers of how the body handles sugar, such as fasting blood glucose levels. Established in 1958, the BLSA is an ongoing prospective observational study of normal aging in community dwelling volunteers. We found that reduced number of taste buds, lower fungiform papilla density, is strongly correlated both with advancing age and with higher fasting blood glucose levels. These results support the hypothesis that taste bud density plays a role in how the body uses sugar during the aging process. Now, again, we might lack a little bit of background to fully appreciate the implications of this study, but might we have a better appreciation of what the study is all about after reading this more plain language summary? Hopefully, that's the intent. So in terms of the different strategies that were used, we see shorter sentences and paragraphs, like even just visually, instead of this block of dense text, we see some white space, helping to separate that information. And so already we know, I'll be able to take a little bit of a break as I'm reading. Things have been organized, they've been chunked for me, so I don't have to hold all this information in my mind as I'm reading, because some of that organization has happened for me already. We've taken some of that contextual information that was all about like the origins of the broader study, and we've separated them out because it's sort of secondary information, and because that's been parsed out as its own little paragraph, we know that, okay, I don't have to complicate my appreciation of the current study with sort of the origins of this larger investigation. I think one of the most effective things, though, is that we have simpler words used first. So instead of having like taste buds in parentheses, we've done the reverse here. We've foregrounded taste buds, and then included that more scientific terminology in the parentheses that follow. Likewise, we have reference to sugar in advance of glucose. So we're able to connect with more common words in order to appreciate the more complex ones that follow. And then in instances where we could just simply switch out a more complex or specialized word for a simpler word, that's what's happened. So we have normal instead of normative. We have sugar instead of glucose. So again, the tone is still very academic. None of the complexity of the study has been removed. It's all about ensuring that more people could read and understand this information rather than simplifying the content. What we've done instead is we've simplified how we are presenting the content. And that's the key of plain language and how we can make a plain language summary. All right, so next steps and takeaways. We're just 2 minutes over. If you're interested in the concept of plain language, there are a couple of self-directed courses that you can take online. They're free. You just sort of do them on your own time. Notably, we see them out of some very specific types of organizations. So the first one is Federal Aviation Administration in the United States. Makes a lot of sense. You want people who are helping to direct aircraft to communicate very effectively. And so it makes sense that professionals in that field would value something like plain language. Likewise, the government of British Columbia, they have a plain language course that you can access. And that's in line with their policies around ensuring that the greatest number of people living in that province understand what the government wants them to do. And then National Institutes of Health, this is in the United States, plain language, getting started or brushing up. Again, health fields are often very interested in plain language to help ensure public awareness and compliance with health directives. And I think we've certainly seen how important things around scientific and health communication are given the current pandemic. So there's a lot of importance in helping to ensure that people really understand what's going on. And just a couple of takeaways to wrap up. So hopefully you feel that plain language has many benefits. So it can improve readability and understanding, ease knowledge sharing, and help promote public engagement. And we can also make our language plainer by using multiple strategies. So if you want to make use of active rather than passive sentences, for instance, make use of lists or paragraphs in intentional ways, substituting simpler language, all of that can be incorporated into your academic writing to help make even your academic writing a bit more plain and accessible. And if you're interested in learning more, of course, you have some free self-paced courses that are available for you. So a couple of additional texts that you might want to engage with if you're passionate about this topic. But just a reminder that your university library is here to help. And thanks again so much for inviting me to talk about plain language here today. We went a minute or two over, but thanks again for having me here to talk about this subject.
Thank you for being with us today. I'm going to stop the recording, but still, please go ahead and unmute yourself and put things in the chat and ask questions.